Every house has its secrets, but for Leo, the secret was a physical wall he couldn't pass. Imagine living 18 years under a roof where one door remained eternally bolted. No one went in, and no one came out. His parents spoke of it in hushed tones, their faces turning pale whenever his hand drifted toward the brass handle. They told him it was a storage room for broken dreams and rotting wood, but the house felt like it was breathing through that locked frame. The air in the hallway always felt 5 degrees colder near that door. On his 18th birthday, the weight of the unknown became too heavy to bear. He didn't know that by turning the key, he was turning his back on his entire life. What lay inside wasn't just furniture or dust, it was a truth so massive it would shatter his reality. Before we dive into this chilling mystery, take a second to hit that like button, drop a comment and subscribe, because what you're about to witness will leave you absolutely speechless. Let's begin. The house on Miller Lane was an old Victorian structure that groaned under the weight of its own history. For Leo, it was the only world he had ever known. He was a quiet boy with observant eyes, and from the moment he could crawl, he noticed the door. It was located at the very end of the second-floor landing, tucked away in a corner where the wallpaper was peeling. Unlike the other doors in the house, which were painted a soft white, this one was dark, heavy oak. It had 2 deadbolts and a padlock chain that rattled whenever the wind blew through the attic. His father, Thomas, was a stern man who didn't like questions. His mother, Sarah, was gentler but always seemed to be looking over her shoulder. Whenever Leo asked about the room, they gave him the same practiced answer. "It's dangerous, Leo," his father would say, not looking up from his newspaper. "The floorboards are weak and the mold is toxic. It's better to pretend that room doesn't exist." But Leo couldn't ignore it. Every night as he lay in his own bed just 2 doors down, he heard things. It wasn't the sound of ghosts, but the soft, rhythmic clicking of a typewriter and the smell of fresh lavender. By the time Leo turned 12, his curiosity had become a quiet fire. He began to keep a log in a small notebook, recording every strange occurrence related to the locked room. He noticed that his mother disappeared into the hallway every Tuesday morning with a heavy ring of keys while his father was at work. She would stay there for exactly 10 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were always red, and she smelled like that signature lavender scent. She never brought anything out with her, and she always ensured the locks were fastened tight before Leo could see anything. One afternoon, Leo decided to test the toxic mold theory. When his parents were in the garden, he crept up to the door and pressed his ear against the wood. He didn't hear the silence of a dead room. Instead, he heard the faint hum of a mechanical device, perhaps a fan or a heater. If the room was truly abandoned and dangerous, why was it being climate-controlled? He reached out to touch the handle, but before his fingers could make contact, a floorboard creaked behind him. His father was standing at the top of the stairs, his face a mask of cold fury that Leo had never seen before. "I told you never to go near that door," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling with a strange mix of anger and fear. He didn't yell, which made it worse. He grabbed Leo by the shoulder and led him downstairs, sat him at the kitchen table and stared at him for a long time. That day, the rules changed. A motion-activated camera was installed in the hallway, and Leo was forbidden from going to the second floor except to go straight to his bedroom. The tension in the house became thick, like a fog that wouldn't lift. For the next 6 years, Leo played the part of the obedient son. He focused on his schoolwork and kept his head down, but his mind never left that hallway. He studied lock-picking from old manuals he found at the library and practiced on small padlocks he bought with his allowance. He learned how to move silently, avoiding the boards that groaned and the patches of light that the camera caught. He knew that on his 18th birthday, his parents planned to take a weekend trip to the coast. It was the first time he would be left alone in the house for 48 hours. It was his only chance. The morning of his 18th birthday arrived with a grey, drizzly sky. His parents seemed nervous, hovering over their suitcases in the foyer. "We'll be back Sunday evening," Sarah said, hugging Leo a little too tightly. "There is plenty of food in the fridge. Stay downstairs, stay safe, and remember what we told you." Thomas gave him a sharp, warning look before they finally pulled out of the driveway. Leo watched their car disappear around the bend of the road. He waited for an hour, sitting in the silence of the living room, listening to the house settle. The silence felt different now. It wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. He went to the kitchen and grabbed the small kit he had hidden behind the cleaning supplies. It contained a set of tension wrenches, a flashlight, and a pair of gloves. He walked to the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew where the camera was located, and he had spent weeks figuring out its blind spots. By hugging the left wall and moving in a low crouch, he could bypass the sensor. He reached the end of the hallway, standing before the dark oak door that had haunted his dreams for 18 years. First lock was a standard deadbolt. Leo's hands were shaking, but he took a deep breath and inserted the tools. He remembered the clicking sound he had heard through the door over the years. Within seconds he felt the cylinder turn. Click, one down. The second deadbolt was more stubborn. It was an older model, heavy and rusted. He had to be patient, feeling for the pins as they set. After what felt like an eternity, the second lock gave way. Now only the padlock and the heavy chain remained. The padlock was a high-security brand, but Leo had researched this specific model. He used a shim he had fashioned from a soda can, sliding it into the gap near the shackle. With a sharp tug, the lock popped open. He caught the heavy chain before it could hit the wood and make a noise. He was standing in front of the bare door now, no obstacles left. He placed his hand on the brass knob. It was cold, colder than any other handle in the house. He turned it slowly. The hinges didn't creak, they had been recently oiled. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Leo expected to find a dark, dusty cavern filled with boxes. Instead, he was blinded by a soft, warm light. The room was perfectly clean. There was no mold, no rot, and no broken furniture. It was a nursery, decorated in pale blues and creams. A white wooden crib stood in the center of the room, and a mobile of silver stars hung from the ceiling, slowly rotating in the draft he had created. On the far wall, a bookshelf was packed with children's stories, their spines looking brand new. The smell of lavender was overwhelming here, coming from a diffuser sitting on a small side table. Leo walked toward the crib, his footsteps muffled by a thick plush rug. Inside the crib lay a small knitted blanket with the name Julian embroidered in gold thread. Leo ran his fingers over the letters. He didn't have a brother named Julian. He had been told he was an only child, a miracle baby born after years of his parents trying. But the date on a framed birth certificate on the wall stopped his heart. It was dated 2 years before he was born. The birth certificate listed Sarah and Thomas as the parents, but the child's name was Julian Thomas Miller. Leo looked at the photograph next to the certificate. It showed his parents, looking younger and strangely terrified, holding a dark-haired baby. As Leo scanned the room, he realized something even more disturbing. The room didn't look like a memorial for a dead child. There was a fresh glass of water on the nightstand, and a pair of small shoes neatly placed by the chair, as if a child had just stepped out of them. He opened the closet door, expecting to find old clothes. Instead, he found rows of outfits in varying sizes, ranging from infant wear to clothes that would fit an 18-year-old. Someone had been buying clothes for a growing boy for nearly 2 decades. At the back of the closet, Leo found a heavy metal filing cabinet. It was locked, but after his success with the front door, this was easy. He pried it open and found a stack of newspapers from a city 300 miles away. The headline on the top paper made his blood run cold. Billionaire's heir missing. Infant Julian Thorne vanishes from estate. Leek stared at the name. Julian Thorne, not Julian Miller. He looked at the photo in the newspaper. The infant had a distinctive birthmark on his right wrist, shaped like a small crescent moon. Leo slowly pulled back the sleeve of his own shirt. On his right wrist, the same crescent moon mark stared back at him. A wave of nausea hit him so hard he had to lean against the wall. He wasn't Leo Miller. He was Julian Thorne. The people downstairs, the people who had raised him, weren't his parents. They were kidnappers. He began to frantically dig through the filing cabinet. He found legal documents, original police reports, and a set of forged identity papers for Leo Miller. There were also letters, dozens of them, written by his mother Sarah but never sent. They were addressed to a woman named Clara Thorne. In the letters, Sarah pleaded for forgiveness. claiming they only took him because they couldn't have children of their own and they knew they could love him better than a busy billionaire could. The justification was twisted and delusional, painted in the ink of a desperate woman. As Leo read the letters, he realized the clicking sound he had heard for years wasn't a typewriter. It was a high-end police scanner. Tucked under a desk in the corner of the room was a sophisticated communication setup. His father had been monitoring local and federal frequencies for 18 years, listening for any sign that the Thorne family or the police were getting closer to finding them. They hadn't been living a quiet life. They had been living as fugitives in plain sight, hiding him in a room that was a shrine to his own stolen identity. He found a hidden floorboard beneath the desk. When he pried it up, he discovered a small wooden box. Inside was a collection of jewelry, diamonds and gold watches that clearly didn't belong to a middle-class family. These were items taken from the Thorne estate on the night of the kidnapping. There was also a burner phone that was still turned on. A single message sat on the screen from an unsaved number. It read, "They are reopening the cold case. We need to move him tonight. Be ready when you get back from the trip." The trip wasn't a celebration. It was a preparation for a final escape. His parents weren't at the coast. They were likely scouting a new location or meeting an accomplice. Leo felt the walls of the room closing in. The lavender scent that had once seemed soothing now smelled like a funeral home. He realized why they kept the room locked. It wasn't just to hide the evidence. It was to keep him away from the truth of who he was until they could disappear again. He heard a sound from downstairs, the heavy thud of the front door closing. His heart stopped. They were supposed to be gone until Sunday. It was only Friday evening. He heard his father's voice, low and urgent. "Did you check the perimeter?" his father asked. "The sensor didn't go off, but I have a bad feeling," Sarah replied. Leo realized he hadn't reset the camera properly, or perhaps they had a second system he didn't know about. He was trapped in the very room they had spent 18 years forbidding him to enter. Leo scrambled to put the documents back into the filing cabinet. He tried to move silently, but his hands were shaking so violently that he dropped the metal box. The clang sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. Downstairs, the talking stopped instantly. He heard heavy footsteps racing toward the stairs. "Leo," his father shouted, his voice no longer calm. "Leo, are you up there?" Leo looked around the room for a weapon or an exit, but there were no windows in this room, another detail he hadn't noticed before. It was a reinforced box. He barely managed to shove the floorboard back into place when he heard the locks on the outside of the door turning. He stood in the center of the nursery, the light of the stars spinning above him. The door swung open and Thomas stood there, holding a roll of heavy-duty duct tape and a zip tie. Sarah stood behind him, her face streaked with tears. "You weren't supposed to see this, Julian," she sobbed, using his real name for the first time. The mask of the loving mother had completely vanished, replaced by something hollow and terrifying. "Stay away from me," Leap said, his voice cracking. He held up the newspaper clipping with the Thorne name on it. "I know who I am, you stole me." Thomas stepped into the room, his eyes cold. "We saved you," he said firmly. "The Thornes were cold, distant people. You were just an accessory to them. We gave you a life. We gave you love." Leo looked at the locks on the door and the bars he now realized were hidden behind the curtains. "This isn't love," Leo shouted. "This is a prison." Thomas moved with a speed Leo didn't expect. He lunged forward, grabbing Leo's arms. Leo fought back, kicking and scratching, but his father was stronger. Sarah watched from the doorway, wringing her hands but making no move to stop it. "It's for your own good," she kept whispering. "We're going to a new place, a better place. You'll have a bigger room there." They managed to pin him down, and Leo felt the cold plastic of a zip tie tighten around his wrists. He was dragged toward the corner of the room, where a hidden door in the back of the closet led to a narrow, dark space. The hidden space was a small, soundproofed room barely large enough for a cot. It was clear this was their contingency plan. If the police ever came, they would hide him here. Thomas pushed him inside and locked the small steel door. "We'll be ready to leave in an hour," Thomas said through the small grate. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Leo was left in total darkness. The air was thin, and the smell of lavender was even stronger here, likely pumped in to keep him sedated or calm. But Leo hadn't spent 18 years being curious for nothing. He remembered the burner phone he had seen on the desk. In the struggle, he had managed to swipe it and tuck it into his back pocket. His hands were tied in front of him, so he awkwardly reached back and pulled the phone out. The screen glowed, illuminating his tiny prison. He had no signal in the reinforced room, but he saw an emergency call option. He tapped it, praying that the signal might penetrate the wood and steel. The call wouldn't go through. The room was a Faraday cage designed to block all electronic signals. Leo felt a surge of despair. He looked around the small space with the phone's light. He saw a small vent near the floor. If he could get close to it, maybe the signal could escape. He shuffled on his knees toward the vent and held the phone against the metal slats. One bar of signal appeared. He dialed 911. "Emergency, what is your location?" a voice crackled. Leo whispered as loud as he dared, explaining the situation, the Thorne kidnapping, and the house on Miller Lane. "Please hurry," he begged. "They are planning to move me." The operator told him to stay on the line, but the signal was flickering. Suddenly he heard the sound of a heavy engine starting outside. It was his father's truck. They were backing it up to the garage. He heard the sound of heavy trunks being dragged across the floor. They were clearing out the house, erasing 18 years of a fake life in a matter of minutes. He had to do something to delay them. Leo looked at the vent again. It wasn't just a vent for air. It was connected to the house's old heating duct system. He realized that if he could cause a distraction, it might buy the police enough time. He used his teeth to rip the hem of his shirt and stuffed the fabric into the vent. Then, using a small lighter he had kept in his pocket for emergencies during his lock-picking practice, he lit the cloth. Smoke began to curl into the duct. He knew it was risky, but he needed the smoke detectors to go off. Within minutes, the high-pitched wail of the fire alarm pierced through the house. He heard his parents shouting. "What did he do? Where is that smoke coming from?" Thomas yelled. The distraction worked. Instead of loading the truck, they were frantically searching for the source of the fire. Leo heard them coughing as the smoke began to fill the hallway. He huddled near the floor, breathing through his sleeve, hoping the authorities were already on their way. The sound of sirens grew in the distance, faint at first, then becoming a deafening roar. Blue and red lights began to flash through the small cracks in the house's siding. "Police, open up!" a voice boomed through a megaphone. Leo heard his father curse. "We have to go, Sarah, leave him." "No," Sarah screamed. "We can't leave Julian." The front door was kicked in with a massive crash. Leo heard shouting, the sound of boots on the stairs, and the frantic cries of his mother. "He's in the room, the locked room." Sarah was hysterical now. Leo kicked the steel door of his hiding spot as hard as he could. "I'm here, in the closet," he screamed. The door to the nursery was thrown open, and he heard the sound of heavy tools prying at the closet wall. Finally, the steel door was wrenched open, and a police officer in tactical gear pulled him out. Leo was led out of the smoke-filled nursery, past the spinning stars and the lavender scent, and down the stairs he had been forbidden to climb. Outside, the cool night air felt like a miracle. He saw his parents being loaded into separate police cars. Sarah was sobbing, looking at him with a terrifying longing, while Thomas remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ground. Leo was wrapped in a shock blanket and sat on the back of an ambulance. A detective approached him, holding a folder. "You're Julian Thorne," the man said softly. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." The next few hours were a blur of questions and medical exams. Leo learned that the Thorne family had never stopped looking for him. His biological father had passed away years ago from the stress, but his mother, Clara, was still alive. She had spent her entire fortune on private investigators and charities for missing children. The detective told Leo that Clara was on a private jet at that very moment, flying across the country to meet the son she thought she had lost forever. The transition was jarring. Leo was taken to a secure hotel where he was given new clothes, real clothes, not the ones chosen for a Leo. He looked in the mirror and realized he didn't know the person looking back at him. Was he the boy who liked old books and lock-picking, or was he a billionaire heir? The parents who had raised him were facing life in prison for kidnapping, conspiracy, and identity theft. Everything he thought was a memory was actually a lie built on a foundation of a crime. The next morning, the detective knocked on his door. "She's here," he said. Leo walked into the hotel lobby and saw a woman who looked exactly like the photos he had found in the locked room, only older and more fragile. When Clara saw him, she didn't run. She fell to her knees, clutching her chest. Leo walked over to her, and for the first time in 18 years he felt a hug that didn't feel like a cage. It felt like home. Over the next few months, the story became a national sensation. The locked room kidnapping was on every news channel. Leo, now legally Julian, moved into the Thorne estate. It was a world of marble floors and vast gardens, the polar opposite of the cramped house on Miller Lane. But Julian found it hard to adjust. He missed the quiet routine of his old life, even if that life was a lie. He felt like a ghost haunting a palace. He began to attend therapy to process the trauma of his upbringing. He learned that his captors had been former staff members at the Thorne estate who were fired for theft. Taking the baby was their way of getting revenge and fulfilling their own twisted desire for a family. They had moved multiple times in the first few years before settling in the house on Miller Lane, where they thought the locked room would be their ultimate secret. Julian visited the prison once to see Sarah. He needed to know if any part of his childhood was real. She sat behind the glass, looking older and grey. "Did you ever love me?" he asked. Sarah pressed her hand against the glass. "You were our whole world, Julian. We just wanted to keep you safe from the world." Julian realized then that their love was a form of ownership. They didn't love him, they loved the idea of him. He stood up and walked away, finally closing the door on that part of his life. He decided to use his inheritance to help other families of missing children. He turned the Thorne estate into a foundation headquarters. He became an expert in security and child safety, using the skills he had learned while trying to break into that locked room for good. He realized that while his past was stolen, his future was entirely his to build. He never used the name Leo again, but he kept the small notebook he had used to track the secrets of the house. Years passed and the house on Miller Lane was eventually torn down. Julian stood across the street as the wrecking ball swung into the dark oak door. He watched as the nursery, the lavender diffusers, and the hidden closet were reduced to splinters and dust. It was a cathartic moment. The physical prison was gone, and the mental one was fading. He realized that the locked room hadn't just been a place. It was a symbol of the truth that always finds a way out. He married a woman who understood his need for transparency and honesty. They had a child of their own, a boy they named Thomas, not after his kidnapper, but to reclaim the name for someone who would grow up in a house with no locked doors. Every room in their home was filled with light, and every question their son asked was answered with the truth. Julian made sure that his son knew exactly who he was from the very beginning. One day, while cleaning out some old files at the foundation, Julian found a letter that had been missed in the initial investigation. It was a letter from his biological father, written just days before he died. It was a message to Julian in case he was ever found. "My dearest son," it read, "I don't know where you are, but I know who you are. You are a thorn and you are loved. Never let anyone tell you that you don't belong." Julian wept as he read the words. He realized that even though he had been missing for 18 years, he had never been truly lost. The bond of his real family had remained, a silent signal that had eventually guided him home. He framed the letter and hung it in his office, a reminder that the truth is the most powerful force in the world. He was no longer the boy in the hallway. He was the man who had stepped through the door and found himself. The story of the locked room became a legend in the town, a cautionary tale about the secrets people keep. But for Julian, it was just the prologue to a much bigger story. He spent his life ensuring that no other child would have to grow up wondering what was behind a locked door. He became a beacon of hope for families who were still searching, a living proof that miracles and justice are possible. He often thought back to that 18th birthday. He remembered the fear, the smoke, and the sound of the locks clicking open. He realized that the day he opened that door wasn't just the day his life changed. It was the day his life began. The darkness of the house on Miller Lane had been replaced by the brilliance of a life lived in the light. He had traded a fake family for a real legacy, and a locked room for the entire world. As Julian grew old, he sat in his garden watching his grandchildren play. He felt a deep sense of peace. He had lived a life of purpose, turning a tragedy into a triumph. He knew that the scars of his past would always be there, like the crescent moon mark on his wrist, but they didn't define him. They were simply part of the map that had led him to where he was supposed to be. He looked up at the sky, the same sky he used to watch through the bars of the locked room. Now there were no bars, only the infinite horizon. He smiled, knowing that he had done what his parents, his real parents, would have wanted. He had lived, he had loved, and most importantly, he had remained true to himself. The secret of the locked room was finally, fully at rest. In the end, Julian realized that everyone has a locked room in their lives, a fear or a secret they are afraid to face. His journey had taught him that the only way to find freedom is to turn the key. It might be terrifying and it might change everything, but the truth is always worth the cost. He closed his eyes, listening to the laughter of his family, the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The boy who wasn't allowed to cross the hallway had become a man who had crossed the world. And as the sun set over the Thorne estate, Julian Thorne knew that he was exactly where he belonged. The locks were gone, the doors were open, and the story was finally complete. He had found his name, his family, and his soul. And that, he realized, was the greatest miracle of all.